Okay, exam for Friday is going to be Chapter 3 Federalism, it's going to be Chapter 5 Civil Rights, and it's going to be Chapter 11 Congress. And like I was saying in class today, for Chapter 3 Federalism, I went back through, the terms were not at the bottom of the outline, they are down there now. And the bulk of the terms for Chapter 3 are going to come from the very bottom of that outline. So commerce power, tax and spend power, privileges and immunities, basically the terms come from pretty much the bottom of the outline. And on this, make sure that you can define them, but give me examples. Chapter 5 has fewer terms. There's some court cases and things. The bulk of Chapter 5 is going to come from the articles and the links, so make sure that you feel really good with the articles and the links in Chapter 5. And then Chapter 11, I've cut down. Chapter 11 for the 11 o'clock class, I think, has 2 articles. For the 12 o'clock class, it only has 1. So basically, Chapter 11 is going to be dealing with terms and chapter questions primarily. Chapter questions will come from all 3 chapters, but primarily from Chapter 11, it's going to be terms and it's going to be chapter questions. So as we get started, why don't we start with the Congress, since that's the one that's been cut. And as you look at things from Chapter 11, does anything jump out as far as terms that you need to, that you have any questions about?
Yeah, enumerated powers.
Enumerated powers. Enumerated powers are basically the express powers that are specifically written in the Constitution. If there's a question about that, it'll probably be 1 2-point multiple choice. The enumerated powers, like I said, the express powers from the last exam, Congress has power to declare war, Congress has power to coin money would be examples. What else do y'all have from the Congress chapter?
The limits.
Limits. Article 1, Section 8 deals with the powers of Congress, and Article 1, Section 9 deals with the limits that that the Constitution provides on Congress's powers. Do you remember 2 examples of the limits?
No.
Cleverly enough, they're listed right underneath Article 1, Section 9. Bill of Attainder and ex post facto law. What was a Bill of Attainder? Uh-oh.
It was the idea that legislatures would pass a legislature guilty of a particular crime. Congress cannot do so.
Under Article 1, Section 9, the Congress cannot pass a bill that declares somebody guilty of a crime. And that's what a Bill of Attainder is. And when we went over this in class, I had mentioned to y'all, if you got arrested and you were charged with a crime by the police, I had mentioned to you that you would typically get a lawyer. Y'all mentioned back to me that you would typically have your day in court. You would typically have the ability to have witnesses, maybe even take the stand to defend your innocence. Well, notice on this, a Bill of Attainder is where Congress passes a law, and that law is going to declare you guilty. So there is no room for you to defend yourself. There is no room for an attorney. In fact, it's kind of a violation of your due process rights, and we're talking about this within the context of the Fifth Amendment. And if you remember why legislatures would pass laws that would declare you guilty of a crime? Why would they want you to be guilty and get locked up? So they could go after...
Real criminals?
Not real criminals, so they could go after your land. They would typically lock you up, and then when you were in jail, you couldn't defend your land or your property. They would go after you, they would take your land and property, and then by the time you got out, if you did get out, you didn't have anything anymore. So that's what that was.
So that was the Bill of Attainder.
Bill of Attainder, yes. Now, what was the ex post facto law? Because we spent a lot of time on this. Go ahead, Doug.
You can.
It's when, I get the concept. So basically, a law or bill is passed, and whether have you committed that crime or not, previously you are still under accountability for that, even though you acted upon that certain action before it was illegal to do so.
I think you know what you're saying, but I think it's going to come out really kind of confused. If you pass a law today, when should it take effect?
In the future, like.
In some instances immediately, or at least it should take effect in the future. Maybe there would be a month or some time. Oftentimes, bills take effect on January 1st, which is the beginning of the calendar year, or July 1st, which is the beginning of the budget year. So with this in mind, if you pass it today, it should take effect in the future. When does the ex post facto law take effect?
In the past.
In the past. So if you pass it today, and today is the 20th, right?
Yeah.
If you pass it today on the 20th of April, you could actually make it be retroactive so that it would take effect on March the 20th. And what was the problem, bless you, with the idea of that bill taking effect on March 20th, a month in the past, Doug?
Before the law was passed, right?
You would be, well, what about before the law was passed?
Like before the law was passed, you, how do I put it? You wouldn't be suffer consequences because the law was passed in the future, I guess?
You shouldn't have to suffer consequences because when you did what you did, there was no law that said it was illegal. But an ex post facto law means you can pass a law after the fact. And that's what ex post facto means, after the fact. You pass a law after you did something, or the legislature could, and then they could punish you for what you had done in the past. So if you pass a bill today and then you make it retroactive on the 20th of March, anytime you did something that contradicted the law from April in March, even though it wasn't illegal, you could still be punished. What was the example that I had given y'all from class of an ex post facto law?
Breakfast.
The sex offenders?
Sex offender laws. Make sure that you're comfortable. What were they doing with sex offender laws specifically in California?
They were saying that they couldn't live around the radius, I forgot how many miles within the range of the schools.
Schools, childcare facilities, places where children would gather. It kind of depends on the state. Anybody remember what the distance was?
Like a mile and some change.
Okay, I got 15. What's that?
I said 15 feet.
15 feet. Well, that's pretty close to the schools. It was, I believe it was 500 feet up to maybe about a half mile. So the idea was that if you were a convicted sex offender, especially a child sex offender, and then in fact you lived that close to the schools, every time you open your door, every time you look out the window, there's going to be temptation, I guess is what they're saying, so they wanted to move you. What made this ex post facto? Anybody?
What do you mean by that?
What made it an ex post facto law? What would make it questionable or maybe illegal?
Because the sex offenders that were already convicted, the ones that already live in that area and they already served their time, it would affect them too. And since they already served their time, it would be an ex post facto law because now they're included in something that it's not.
That's what it is. If you pass it today, then in theory, anybody that committed one of those crimes today or going forward in the future would now be subject to those criminal penalties. But what they're doing with this is they're making it retroactive. So if you had committed one of these crimes a month before, or a year before, or several years before, now you would be required to move. They're doing it to protect the kids, and it's hard to argue that. And if you remember in your class, some of you said, okay, I believe Brian was one in the 11 o'clock class that said, we need to protect the kids, we need to move these people out of here, this is for safety. Then there were other people, and Martha, I think you were the one that actually argued for the rights of the sex offenders. If they've done their time after they committed the crime, if they've been clean especially, how can you go back and add this on? This wasn't part of the penalty then. Now this kind of jumped into a larger discussion about sex offenders. What was the Family Watchdog website?
Pretty much telling you how many sex offenders would be around your area.
How many sex offenders would be around the area? You can actually type in an address. Then when you do the search, it will tell you the mapped and the unmapped sex offenders that are in the area, the ones that they think they know of, the ones that maybe they've lost track of a little bit. It color-coded it based upon what the offense was, this kind of a thing. And it would place your house in the very center so that you would have an idea of the action that was going on or had been going on in your community. And people get nervous when they see some of the big numbers sometimes. We had also discussed the Georgia sex offender law. Remember, if you start talking about sex offenders, and what were some examples of sex offense crimes that could conceivably end you up on that list?
Peeing behind the tree.
Everybody mentions peeing first. If you pee in public, for example, and every single class knows about this one now. If you hooked up with somebody in a consensual circumstance, like in some places where if it's 18, a high school senior, and maybe 15, a high school freshman, that could conceivably get you on this list because it's under the age of consent. Or maybe there's a difference in the number of years between the person that's older and younger. Maybe it's not just one age of consent. Of course, there's rape, there's sexual assault, these kinds of things. The sexting or those messages sending on the phone. If somebody was 40 and doing something with somebody that was 14 or 15. Again, even if it were consensual, the idea is you could end up in very much trouble. And the trick on this is that some of these things are really horrible. Some of these things are more about mischief, and some of these things are maybe a little bit about immaturity, but you get treated the same way. And based on these sex offender laws, you would have to move whether your offense was serious or if your offense was just something based upon your youth. So kind of keep that in mind. What was the Virginia man that we talked about?
Was that the guy that was naked? No.
Was that the guy that was naked? Yeah, the guy that was naked from Springfield, Virginia. What do you remember about him?
He was.
What's that now?
Wasn't he like laying in his window, like he was drinking coffee,
Going.
and a mom and a little boy, she's walking her son to the bus stop, and they saw him naked, and pretty much he got in trouble for it.
In late October, this man was actually drinking coffee. He was drinking coffee naked in front of a big window. Now, it turns out that this mother was walking, I believe it was her 7-year-old son, walking her 7-year-old son to the bus stop, and what ended up happening? Well, they saw him naked. She reported this to the police, and this was like late October. So if you go back on this, the time was changing. There were a lot of interesting things that were going on there. What was the issue with the naked man drinking coffee? Anybody?
He was in front of a window.
So they saw him, which would make this...
Public.
It would make it almost like he was naked in public. You could also argue indecent exposure would be considered a sex offense crime, even though he was in his own home drinking coffee, behind closed doors. But he was visible. What was the argument that both classes made, really? Because y'all weren't buying that this was a sex offense crime, right?
No.
What'd y'all say?
It's in his own home.
He's in his own home. This is his own business. You get your apartment for the first time by yourself, so you walk around naked whenever you want. Was he ultimately charged? Was he ultimately convicted, I should say?
No.
Why not?
He received a warning.
The article says that the police arrested him because they thought he wanted to be seen naked, and that's a really difficult thing to prove. And a number of the classes that we've dealt with this semester had kind of said, look, if you're not careful with this, somebody that doesn't have a towel in the shower, for example, could run in front of a window to get a towel, and this means that they could be brought up on a sex offense crime, and that's not the way that this should be. The court did end up throwing it out, and I think I talked about this in the 12 o'clock class, but not the 11 o'clock class. So let me make sure I've got this for the 11 o'clock folks. The mother who was walking her son to the bus stop actually cut in between two houses. So this wasn't a window that was like right out front, looking towards the bus stop, but this was a window on the side of the house that people normally don't walk by. So he was drinking his coffee. They took that into consideration. But now that he's been warned, if it happens again, this could conceivably cause that sex offense crime, and this would probably cost him maybe custody or visitation of, at the time, his 5-year-old daughter. He had a daughter as well who was not in the house at that particular moment. What other questions have you got? Anything about terms? Are y'all comfortable with differences between the House and the Senate?
Are we gonna do a chapter questions for chapter 11?
I know we don't have enough time with 20 minutes worth of videotape.
No, like for the test.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'll remove the ones that I can remove. I will do that. Do you have any questions about differences between the House and the Senate?
No.
What's the difference between the terms? How long is the term for a House member? How long is the term for a senator?
6. 2 and 6.
Which one is which?
House is 2.
House is 2, Senate is 6. Why did they make the House a 2-year term?
It's more representative of the actual population of a given state.
It is. It's more representative of the will of the people. And every 2 years, how many House members are actually elected or re-elected?
How?
85%.
It's like 400.
How many members are in the House of Representatives?
437.
435 voting members. So how many members of the House are subject to election every 2 years?
All of them.
All of them are. And the idea is that the House is going to be most reflective of the popular will. The House is going to be most reflective of, in fact, what it is that the people want. And the House is actually going to be very volatile, which means in one election, if the American people are upset at the majority Republicans, the Democrats can win it. And in fact, 2 years later, the Republicans can win it back. So they set it up this way. The Senate is 6-year terms. How are they elected? All every 6 years?
No, just 2/3.
Third of them every 2 years.
1/3
1/3.
every 2 years. And why?
just the way the
Just
math
because
works.
the quality.
They want to slow the process down. And if you remember, and this is what I want you to explain, if I give you a question that says, explain the differences between the House and the Senate, don't say the House has a 6-year term and the House has a 2-year term and the Senate has 6, but explain why, which is what we're dealing with right now. The Senate divides it up and they want to slow the process down. So 1/3 in 2 years, 1/3 in 2 years, 1/3 in 2 years. So if the House is always thinking, pass it, we got to get this done, we got to get stuff going, the Senate is thinking slower. Let's not go too fast. Let's think this through kind of a thing. So the Senate actually is more of a check on the House. The House is more of a check on the Senate than in fact the courts or the president are on the Congress. They kind of rival each other. Senate has 100 members, House has 435. Why?
Hold on.
Because
How many does Senate have?
Virginia plan and
Which one is the Virginia plan?
House.
Virginia plan is representation is based on population, so 435 House members are going to be coming from that representation. The number of people in the state gives you more. The Senate is based on the New Jersey plan, which is based on, it's not population, what's the other thing?
Quality?
Equality, yes. So all states have 2, and remember that. So there's the difference in the terms, there's the difference in how they're elected, there's the difference in the representation between the 2. What about the difference between revenue bills and treaties and appointments? Oh, this is a big one.
House is in charge of
You said revenue bills?
Yes.
revenue bills.
All
The
revenue
Senate
bills
is
must
in
begin
charge
in
of
House
treaties.
of Representatives. Senate gets to fight House over this. The House is closest to the people.
The House is supposed to be most representative of the people. So the idea is that all revenue bills dealing with spending, dealing with taxes, are going to originate in the House because they're basically dealing with people's property. So that's why they have them there. Now understand, the House initiates them. They get the first say on it, but the Senate does get to debate. The Senate does get to amend on their side. They're going to be able to compare their 2 bills at the end of the process. So the Senate is going to have a voice in this. What's different about treaties and appointment? Go ahead,
The
Gene.
Senate has a final say on it,
The Senate has a final say on
on the bills.
which bills?
The ones that the one that you said have to deal with the people's properties.
No, I didn't say that. The Senate is going to get a voice on revenue bills, but the House starts them. So both the House and the Senate get a voice on this. Go ahead.
The Senate deals with treaties and appointments, no one else.
The Senate deals with treaties and appointments. The President, Secretary of State can negotiate a treaty, but the United States is not bound by it until the Senate approves it. Make sure that you remember that. The President can nominate a Supreme Court justice or an ambassador or a public minister, a member of the executive cabinet, for instance, or the executive branch in some instances. But this person does not take office until the Senate says yes. And if the Senate says no or never considers it, then that presidential appointment really doesn't move very far. And we talked about this within the context of Scalia, the Supreme Court justice just having died. There is a nomination. The Senate is dragging its feet significantly on this. We'll see what happens. But for our purposes, the Senate has the final say on treaties and appointments. Gee, that's why I asked you before which one. And the House never gets to consider these. Some people say that the House and the Senate are basically the kind of brother and sister, they're co-equal, but when you consider that the Senate has some powers that the House doesn't and they get the final say on them, some people will say that the Senate is a little bit more prestigious and there are fewer senators to boot. What about debate? The difference between debate in the House and debate in the Senate.
You have a certain amount of time to talk, so you can ask.
Which one? House or
House.
Senate? Go ahead.
And you can ask for the people to have their time.
The House is very structured with having 435 voting members. So you get a specific amount of time and you can continue to talk as long as somebody else gives you their time. But when they do not give you their time, then at that point you've got to stop. How does it work in the Senate?
You have all the time you want.
What's that called?
A filibuster.
Filibuster is the idea that you have unlimited debate, and when you get control, what do? When you get control of the floor, what do?
You just keep talking.
You just keep talking. You have to talk about the bill.
No.
What kinds of things do people talk about?
Anytime you can.
Candy and
They talk about candy.
phone books.
All right. Phone books, they read from the phone books. Yeah, I'm not going to say candy. Phone books, they read from the phone books. Grocery lists, they've read their grocery list. Sometimes people get up there and read from the Bible or Dr. Seuss or different things like this. And what was the longest one? Filibuster?
24 hours.
It was over 24 hours by who?
A guy that was against civil rights.
The guy, it's always got to be Carolina. Yeah, just dump on us. It was dealing with civil rights. It was Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. Spoke, I think it was like 24 hours and over 30 minutes, like 36 or 38 minutes. And he did it in a row. Almost immediately afterwards, they passed the bill that he was filibustering, but he was like just almost worshipped in his state because he did everything he could do to stop that particular process. So keep that in mind, the idea of the filibuster. How can you stop a filibuster? What is the vote called? Oh, closure. A vote of closure. C-L-O-T-U-R-E. And how many senators do you need to get a closure vote passed? 60. Remember 60 on that. You started to ask a question, Martha.
Yeah, because you said 59 and.
Right.
So filibustering can be used for and against the bill, or just
Filib-
for passing?
Filibustering is usually when you're against the bill and the minority party attempts to basically stop the business of the Senate. So when somebody is filibustering, no bills can be introduced, nothing can be voted on. The Senate is basically powerless while this person continues to talk. And oftentimes what they'll do is maybe they'll pull the bill or they'll try and amend the bill just to get the person that's filibustering to shut up. That's what they do. Yeah. What other questions do y'all have from the Congress chapter? I would focus on characteristics of the House and Senate. Powers of the House and Senate kind of overlap a little bit. We didn't get into impeachment on this one. That's going to be on the final.
So we have to focus on what?
Basically those terms right there. And if you notice, there's a video that's in there that deals with differences between the House and the Senate. It's posted in Blackboard. If you watch that, if we've talked about this stuff in class, those are the ones to be focused on. When it gets to something like impeachment, which we just haven't talked about yet, I'm not going to test you on that. So I'm saying that on camera for sure. What do you want to move into next? Civil rights, or you want to move into federalism?
It's about the Congress. What's Franklin?
Franking is not on this exam, so don't worry about it. What other questions do y'all have?
What is the one?
Oh, you said how many?
What is the what?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say how many representatives are in the Senate? You said.
There's 100 senators. So there's 2 per state. It's based on equality. Go ahead, David.
Number 10 of the chapter question.
What is the one power the vice president has as the president of the Senate? Does anybody know?
What?
Say it
Is the
again?
one?
What is the one power the vice president has as president of the Senate? Number 10. Vice president, if the Senate ties, casts the tie-breaking vote. You can argue that the vice president is the one that will take over if something happens to the president. Okay, but really the one power is that the vice president presides over the Senate, and if there's ever a tie, the vice president is the one that breaks that tie. What other questions have y'all got?
Can we go over Dred Scott?
Sure, push the button and stop it.